Welcome to the urgent question. Dame Diana Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Will the Cabinet Office make a statement on the evidence uncovered of experiments on children in the contaminated blood scandal and update the House on the action the government is taking on the second interim report from Sir Brian Langstaff?
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Let me start by stating that the stories reported in the recent BBC News article, and indeed in the Sunday Times reporting of Caroline Wheeler, demonstrate the unimaginable suffering of all of those impacted by this dreadful scandal. As the House will know, in 2017, the Government established an independent public statutory inquiry chaired by Sir Brian Langstaff to give those impacted and their families the answers that they deserve. Since it was established, the inquiry has taken evidence from a range of sources, and the testimonies given to the inquiry are indicative of the bravery of every individual who has come forward on this issue. The Infected Blood Inquiry's final report is due to be published within a month, on the 20th of May this year. We expect the inquiry's findings will cover a set of extremely challenging issues, and it would not be right for the Government to preempt the findings of this long-prepared and carefully considered report. The Government has committed to update Parliament through an oral statement on next steps within 25 sitting days following the 20th of May, and it is our intention to make this statement as soon as possible. The 25-day stipulation is a deadline, certainly not a target. In January of this year, I appointed an expert group to provide technical advice to the Cabinet Office on responding to the Infected Blood Inquiry's recommendations on compensation. This work is well underway and will build on the recommendations of the Infected Blood Inquiry to inform the Government's substantive response to the inquiry's recommendations on compensation. The Government understands the need to move quickly to provide compensation to victims of infected blood. Most recently, we tabled amendments just last Wednesday to the Victims and Prisoners Bill, which impose a duty on the Government to establish an infected blood compensation scheme. It also establishes a new arm's-length body, named the Infected Blood Compensation Authority, to deliver the compensation scheme, which will operate on a UK-wide basis to ensure parity and consistency. This demonstrates our absolute commitment, Mr. Speaker, to deliver long overdue justice to victims of infected blood. We of course understand that for many there is an urgent need for compensation. As the House will know, in October 2022, the Government paid over £400 million in interim compensation to help to ease the short-term needs of those infected. The Government amendment also includes a statutory duty to make interim payments of £100,000 to estates of the deceased infected people who were registered with existing or former support schemes where previous interim payments have not already been made to infected individuals or their bereaved partners. This is an important step forward to get substantial compensation into the hands of families of victims of infected blood. Should that Government amendment be supported in the other place, it will return to this House for debate during the usual process of the Commons consideration of Lord's amendments.
Okay, that's good. Dame Diana Johnson.
We know that over 3,000 people have already died in the worst treatment disaster in the history of the NHS. Another 680 have died since the public inquiry started in 2018. And with 2 people dying on average every week, 100 people have died since Sir Brian made his final recommendations on paying compensation in April 2023. He said wrongs have been done on an individual, collective and systemic level. He also said in all conscience he could not wait until his final report was published to tell the Government to start to pay compensation. And then last week, Hugh Pym, the BBC produced shocking evidence about children, even babies, being experimented on in the 1970s and 80s without their parents' consent. These disturbing revelations raise very serious criminal and ethical issues for the NHS and the medical profession, possibly breaches of the 1947 Nuremberg Code. Now, alongside this, at the weekend, the Sunday Times, and Caroline Wheeler in particular, launched a campaign for compensation to be paid now, to those infected and affected by the contaminated blood scandal. So far, over 160 MPs backed this campaign, 10 parties are represented, including 6 leaders. Last week, the government finally laid those amendments to the Victims and Prisoners Bill in the other place after this House forced the government to act in December last year. And this weekend, ministers confirmed that even when Sir Brian produces his final report on the 20th of May, the government may not respond until as late as the 3rd of July 2024. Meanwhile, no announcement on funding for the compensation body or any compensation scheme, despite the government having accepted the moral case for compensation. So my questions are these. What action is the government taking on the BBC story last week on experiments on children? Secondly, when will Sir Brian's recommendations on compensation be implemented in full? And what date will payments be made to those infected and affected? And why haven't the interim payments been paid as Sir Brian recommended last April? How will those infected and affected be involved in this whole scheme? And fourthly, why are ministers rejecting the 3-month time frame for setting up a compensation body that this House agreed in December last year, and Sir Brian's recommendation that it should be judge-led? Now, on all sides of this House, members know that when people are dying, justice delayed is justice denied. The time to act is now.
Minister.
Well, I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions, and I thank her for her initial comments. I think there's nobody in this House who has done more for the advance of the interests of the infected and affected communities than the Right Honourable Lady. And I have said that consistently since I took office on the 13th of November. I recognise her frustrations, and I'm doing everything I can to address them. I met with her and other chairs cross-party last week, as I did just before the Easter recess, and I will continue to update her as regularly as I can. She draws attention to the commentary from Hugh Pym, other journalists, around the speculations of allegations made, which I believe Sir Brian Langstaff's report, when it is published on the 20th of May, should give substantive airing to, drawing on the evidence collected. I think it would be reasonable for the government to wait for that authoritative statement on what information and evidence they have gathered before we respond. But that does not mean that since I took office, I have been doing anything other than move forward everything I can on compensation as quickly as possible. She is quite right to say that over 3,000 deaths have occurred since 1970, 141 last year. And I recognise that the challenge of securing interim payments urgently is not a concern in terms of the mechanics of how that's done of the infected, affected community. She quite reasonably stands up and urges speed on that. I am doing what I can, and the 100,000, the statutory duty to make an interim payment of 100,000 to estates of the deceased infected people is the first time that we have put in legislation a duty to pay compensation before the ad hoc schemes, which never admitted culpability over the last 45, 50 years. And I've also put into legislation, with the consent of both houses, the need to set up that arm's length body and make it as operational as soon as possible. As I discussed with the Right Honourable Lady last week, my concern is to get that arm's length body up and running as quickly as possible. And so there is a legal obligation to do so when royal assent is gained. So there's no statutory deadline, but there is an there is a responsibility to do that. I recognise the concern around a judge-led body, and indeed the report of Sir Brian Langstaff does suggest that a judge-led body would be desirable. I don't rule that out, but in legislation it seems at this stage reasonable not to confine it in case another candidate could become available. But clearly, gaining the confidence of the affected and infected communities is absolutely integral to this process working. I'm doing everything I can, as I say, to bring forward the substantive response of the government on the widest issues of compensation as soon as I can to the 20th of May. And I will update the House and members of this House as often as I can. Indeed, I've made time available tomorrow for an open surgery for any MP who wants to bring cases to me.
Father of the House, Sir Peter Bottomley.
Can I follow the tributes to the great dame for what she's been doing? I've been actively involved in this one way or another for 25 years, and we all know that the justification for having the Langstaff inquiry has been the information which has now come out in public, which was concealed or not known over the decades. We also know that this is different from most of the discussions over the Pearson report on whether there should be compensation when things go wrong in medical treatment. We now know this is very different to that, and that the report is likely to show how since the war people did not pay enough attention to the warnings which were given by those in the field. And with the Caroline Wheeler update of her book and the BBC programme, we now know that not just the haemophilia trials published in the 1970s, but the 1980s trials showed massive defects by the standards of those days, let alone up-to-date standards. Can I join with the Right Honourable Lady in saying to the Minister, when will it be possible that people can register their names and their background, their circumstances for compensation? Do we have to wait until a month's time for that to happen? And can you say how the government are going to say how this is going to be dealt with? Obviously, as the Cabinet Office Minister, he has followed his successor in carrying responsibility. How far will the Department of Health be involved, and will other departments be involved as well?
The Right Honourable Gentleman makes some very wise observations, and I didn't mean to not pay tribute to him in a similar way. His obviously commitment to this cause over probably my lifetime is extraordinary. With respect to the £100,000 that announced through the tabling of the government amendment last Wednesday, those will we'll be working with the existing compensation, the existing support schemes to expedite those as quickly as possible for the estates of those deceased infected. But forgive me, on the substantive response on the wider complete compensation, what we've done with this intervention last Wednesday, building on the amendment of the Right Honourable Lady, is actually establish that delivery vehicle for compensation. So to the challenge which was reasonably made that somehow we were delaying compensation, I think what I've said to the House this afternoon makes very clear that we are committed in legislation to deliver that compensation, but the terms of how we do that and how we respond to translating those 18 recommendations into reality is work ongoing that I will seek to substantively address as soon as possible by the 20th of May.
Shadow Minister Demney Griffith.
Well, I congratulate my right honourable friend on securing an urgent question on this absolutely vital issue. Nobody could fail to be moved by the scale of the horror and of the injustice of this scandal. And the latest revelations about apparent experiments on children to which this urgent question relates are truly appalling and show yet again how badly the victims have been let down. I pay tribute to all those who've campaigned so hard on the issue. As part of delivering the justice that is so long overdue, the government must now deliver on the compensation scheme. On this issue, time is of the essence. Every week that passes without further government action matters. Those who are infected with contaminated blood are dying at a rate of 1 every 4 days. Ministers have repeatedly accepted the moral case for compensation, but victims understandably have very little faith and want to see firm action. That's why on this side of the House we were very disturbed to hear that the Government has laid an amendment which seeks to undo the cross-party changes to the Victim and Prisoners Bill passed in this House in December last year. The changes the Government wants would have the effect of removing that clear commitment to deliver on the compensation scheme within 3 months of the passing of the bill. Yet another missed opportunity, yet another delay. As a result, I would be grateful if the Minister could answer the following questions. Will the Government now consider accepting the cross-party consensus of establishing a clear 3-month limit for the setting up of the scheme? And can the Minister confirm when victims can expect to receive final compensation payments following the publication of Sir Brian Langstaff's review?
I thank the Right Honourable Lady for her questions. I just want to respectfully say that the Right Honourable Lady's amendment was dependent on royal assent. What I've tried to do is make it effective by actually putting an obligation on the set-up from as soon as royal assent is granted. I think that will speed it up, and I'm working on the operational matters around how such a body would work. She asked me again, as everyone does, about the substantive response of the Government on compensation more broadly. As I've indicated, one of the things that I was doing with appointing the expert group in January was to examine some of the issues in the recommendations. For example, the need for redress for those living with chronic hepatitis B when that chronic infection definition didn't exist. So what I've been doing is seeking professional advice on the operationalisation of the recommendations. But the conclusions of those deliberations, the quantification of it and the discernment of what that compensation will look like will be a matter for the Government when the final report has been published.
Foster. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Like others, I've got cases that have been literally waiting decades for resolution, which were pursued by my predecessor as well. So again, I press, when will they be able to start applying for compensation?
Well, I've mentioned what I refer the Honourable Gentleman to the reply I gave a few moments ago around the 100,000 to the deceased infected estates. But the issue of the sort of ultimate compensation will depend on what is arranged through conversations across Whitehall as soon as possible after the 20th of May. We're making good progress, and I want to bring that forward as quickly as I can on the 20th. And I think it's pretty clear, given the will of the House, the letter with so many MPs having signed it, it is on the Government to deliver, and that's what I'm seeking to do as quickly as I can.
SNP spokesperson Alison Poole.
I pay tribute to the Honourable Member for Kingston upon Hull, who has done so much in this, and to journalists like Caroline Wheeler of the Sunday Times, and to all who have campaigned for decades despite their own very deep trauma. This includes Jan Smith, the mother of Colin, one of the youngest victims infected at only 10 months old, who died aged only 7. And she said in the papers and Sunday Times at the weekend, "When we found out little Colin was going to be treated by a world-renowned haematologist, we were over the moon. Professor Bloom was like a god to us and we didn't question him. We thought our son was being given the best possible treatment, but we will feel forever guilty that we had in fact handed our son over to his killer." These parents should not be burdened with this guilt. There's an estimated 380 children who were infected in a massive breach of trust and medical ethics. It is every parent's worst nightmare. So what does he say to these parents of children who were used as guinea pigs? An utterly despicable practice, but made the worse by the lack of redress for those families. When will all infected and affected receive the compensation they are due, and when will they receive an apology from this Government?
Well, I can reassure the Honourable Lady that I'm doing everything I can to bring that forward as quickly as possible. I recognise the distress is widespread. It's felt across individuals and families across the United Kingdom. I'm working closely with the devolved administrations to ensure that this translates into a UK-wide arm's length body. My officials are working with prominent charities, organisations and support groups. I'm reaching out to them to share progress, to reassure the community that I've heard their concerns and seek their views in advance of 20th of May. I'm doing that out of deep respect for the suffering that they've experienced. And on the substantive matter she asked me about, again, I refer her to the reply I gave a few moments ago.
Oh, Matt Hancock.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. As Secretary of State for Health, I committed the government to ensuring that the compensation recommended by Sir Brian is paid, and committed the moral case that the UK government has to redress this wrong. The stories that we've seen from Caroline Wheeler and Hugh Pym have made that moral case stronger still. Can I push the Minister to move as fast as possible, but also hold in his mind the absolutely critical nature of getting the response right as well as fast, and commend his officials who have worked so hard on this for so long? I entirely understand the need for urgency, but he's got to both get it right at the same time. He's a very diligent and deeply honourable man, and I hope they'll hold that in his heart as he addresses this in the weeks to come.
I thank my right honourable friend for his remarks, and I thank him for what he's done previously on this matter. He is absolutely right. I feel responsibility both to get the substantive announcement agreed as quickly as possible, but also to ensure that I've got a clear communication to the infected and affected community and clear expectations of what will happen following that announcement. I absolutely recognise, from all that I've read and all that my officials have briefed me on, that this is likely to be one of the biggest scandals that this country will ever have seen with respect to things that have happened within the NHS. But I respect Sir Brian Langstaff, the work he's done extensively over several years, and I wait respectfully for his final report on the wider issues on the 20th of May.
Paulette Hamilton.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My constituent just contacted me again yesterday. This constituent's father and uncles were all infected with contaminated blood, and all but 2 of the uncles have now died. And he said to me, I had to grow up in care homes due to my father being too ill to look after me. We have been fighting for many, many years for justice. He thinks the government are dragging their feet on compensating victims. He's right, isn't he?
All I can do is account for what I've done since the 13th of November. I can't really comment on the several decades previous to that. As the Honourable Lady will know, we've had a series of ad hoc schemes, but the government accepting culpability for what happened many years ago and subsequent failure to respond to it will be a matter that we will need to address fully after the 20th of May. But I can reassure her that with the amendment that the government have tabled in the House of Lords, this is the first time that we've put in legislation a duty to pay compensation. It is a start of a more comprehensive response that I'm working on to secure collective agreement across government, and I want to bring that forward as quickly as I'm able.
Sir Julian Lewis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Langstaff recommendation for interim payments was because of the need for speed, because people are so ill. So how many people does the government believe to be still living who are infected in this scandal? How many of them applied for the interim payments? And what proportion of those who applied have received the payments? If my right honourable friend doesn't have the figures with him today, will he undertake to write to me and place a copy of the letter in the House of Commons library?
I thank my right honourable friend for his question. Customarily, he asks precise, penetrating questions, and I don't want to quote him a few figures that I think I know, so I shall write him a considered reply, which I shall obviously make available. There are far too many people that have suffered, far too many people have died, and we need to put this right as quickly as possible.
Wendy Chamberlain.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Engaging with constituents in North East Fife, and I congratulate the Right Honourable Member for her work to date, it is very clear that not only have they lost loved ones to a preventable and painful death, but the stigma that those loved ones lived with during their life is part of the issue. I think members here are right across the House rightly wanting to know answers in relation to the interim payments, because those families have received no compensation and no apology to date. If he can't give a date in terms of when people can expect payments, can he at least give some clarity about how they will be able to apply?
Well, can I just firstly agree entirely with the Honourable Lady with respect to the stigma. And you can't fail to be moved by the accounts of people in the 1980s where, when they contracted HIV, the stigma societally then was very different to where we are today. And the damage that has caused to relationships, to lives, and to the obviously health, sometimes in terminal case for many people. With respect to this statutory duty to make interim payments of £100,000 to estates of the deceased infected people, that will be done through the existing schemes. So we are working with those schemes to work out how best to do that. It is different to recommendation 12 in that the government took the view that we didn't want to overwhelm the will of the estates rather than actually divide it up around family members, which could be problematic and would delay. So whilst I can't give an authoritative date now, there is work ongoing urgently to give clarity on the process for those people to register and receive those payments.
Alexander Stafford.
Indeed, Mr Speaker. The affected blood scandal is one of the biggest stains in the NHS history, and I'm pleased to hear that we're getting interim payments out as quickly as possible. But when the Minister is talking about giving payments to the deceased estates rather than named individuals, could he outline why that reasoning is? We want to make sure that compensation does go to the correct people quickly.
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a very good point. You know, one of the challenges for some cohorts of people is that where they're not registered, but they've been part of a scheme that is now not in existence, you know, how across that affected community do we best expedite that? These are the sorts of practical issues that I'm working through with officials so that we can actually get to the best possible solution when we make that comprehensive response in due course.
Clive Ethan.
Speaker, cheaper than chimpanzees is how former pupils of the Trelaws School described themselves when they gave evidence to the inquiry. My constituent Lee Morey was one of the pupils of that school, and he's described to me how he felt he was experimented on all those years ago. We've set up the Brian Langstaff inquiry. What possibly more can the government want to know than what the inquiry is going to uncover? And why is it that the government is delaying compensation? Will he confirm that there is nothing stopping the government paying compensation from the date that Brian Langstaff gave his interim report last April?
Yeah. Yes, there is a challenge in translating 18 recommendations into numbers and reality of the transmission mechanism, as well as the quantification and agreement across Whitehall. Now, the work on that first part is underway, and that's why we've engaged the experts to work out how we can, across different heads of loss, quantify the payments that will need to be due. Those weren't in the report. Quite reasonably, they weren't in the report. It wouldn't be for Sir Brian Langstaff to put numbers on every single individual, but that work is underway, and we're working now to agree the substantive response as soon as we can from when the final report is made.
Up in Walker.
Mr. Speaker, this week I'll be using the mechanism of this House to do something that in 14 years as an MP I've never felt the need to do before, which is to present a petition. And at the top of that petition will be my constituent, Andrew Evans, one of the children who was infected with hepatitis and HIV, and by a miracle survived to set up and help to run the Tainted Blood campaign. He and many of my affected and infected constituents feel this process has gone on too long already. So I'm very grateful to the Right Honourable Lady who secured this. I'm grateful for my honourable friend for the updates that he's given, particularly about support for the estates of the deceased. But can I urge him to continue to meet with groups like Tainted Blood and make sure that the communication on this is as clear and open as it can be, so that they are engaged and can support their members as this process moves forward, and to do that as fast as possible?
I thank my honourable friend both for what he said today, but also his engagement privately in recent weeks. Everything he says I agree with. His challenge in terms of being clear about communications to prominent charities, organisations and support groups is heard. Letters were sent by my officials last evening to set up those meetings. I've talked to the APPG cross-party representatives seeking input on names of groups. I'm trying to respect their confidence whilst also meet as many representative groups as possible and do that well before the 20th of May.
Kirsty Oswald.
Mr. Speaker, this is surely the worst health scandal that we've seen, and with government after government kicking the can down the road on this, we do need to accept that there is a need for change, but also a need for change in speed and urgency. The continued delays and the continued prevarication, and I regret to say it feels like we've seen some more of that today, really exacerbates the suffering. We know that 2 people are dying every week. He must know that the delay around this is indefensible, and he must know the impact of that. Does he appreciate why there are such a large number of members pushing for action now? And does he understand that that's what we need him to deliver?
Yes, I do understand that. I deeply respect the views of colleagues who've making strong representations on this, and I'm doing everything I can to move it forward as urgently as I can. I won't repeat myself over things that I've obviously said with respect to steps last week and the engagement that and the spirit with which I'm taking that and the reasons why I'm doing that. But speed is absolutely of the essence. I agree with the Honourable Lady. And I'd also say, to the wider issues of what went wrong and why these things happened, of which there's been a lot of speculation in articles in recent days and in Caroline Wheeler's book most prominently, these matters will need to be addressed, but I think through the lens of Sir Brian Langstaff's report to be published finally on the 20th of May.
Andrew Glen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and I want to commend my right honourable friend, not just for securing this urgent question, but for all the work she and others in this place have done on this important matter. Sir Brian Langstaff, in making his final recommendations on compensation early, a whole year ago, did so and recommended that compensatory body to make payments by last December. He did so because he was worried of what the effects of delay would have on the affected and the infected. So can I ask the Minister, because we've missed all of those deadlines, is this what Sir Brian's worst fear looked like?
Well, I sincerely hope not. What I've said with respect to the interim payment is a response to the dialogue I've had across both chambers of the House, working with Earl Howe in the other place. And I've been pretty clear, both in terms of giving a legal entity the obligation to pay compensation. I'm doing everything I can in advance of the final determination of what the government's response is, to put those preparations in place, to minimise that delay, so that it can be operationalised as soon as that decision is finally made.
Wishart.
Every time we come to these urgent questions, we get a well-intentioned minister giving a helpful but frustrating update about what's actually happening. And this Minister is one of the most well-intentioned, and today's statement is one of the most helpful. Now, what we want to hear, and I think the House is saying to him clearly today, is we want a clear timeline about when applications for compensation can be made and when those payments will be made. Now, he's come really close to telling us that today, really close. Can I just encourage him just to get over the line, tell us when this is going to happen, and satisfy all of us who are standing here on behalf of our constituents?
I think the Honourable Gentleman makes a very fair and reasonable point. I would wish to say more than I'm saying today. We haven't quite got to that point. I'm doing everything I can to get to that point. And to his specific point around the mechanics of engagement with communities, I am very seized of the need to have a clear narrative for each different cohort so that we can be as crystal clear when those decisions are made. I do recognise how frustrating it is. Obviously, it is a collective process across government to agree these things, to quantify these things, and to make provision for those things. And I'm doing everything I can using my experience across several years in the Treasury. It is helpful that the Chancellor of the Exchequer was Health Secretary when this public inquiry was called, and I'm working with colleagues across Whitehall to deliver this as quickly as I can.
Kerry McCarthy. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. One of the most upsetting aspects of this whole tragedy, I think, is the thought of those pupils at Trelaw School being experimented on, as one of the pupils said, like lab rats. And that included Michael and brothers Michael and Bill Payne. And I met with their widows, Kath and Margaret, over the Easter recess in Bristol. And I accept that the Minister is trying to give very detailed answers, and I accept that there are complexities. But really what it comes down to is a deep, deep wrong was done to those little boys at Trelaws, and compensation and apologies are owed to them. So can I ask what he's doing to communicate as clearly and effectively as possible with the families of those affected, so that they feel that they're not being swamped by bureaucracy and that answers are close at hand?
Yes, what I'm doing is I've reached out to prominent charities, organisations and support groups to share the progress that's been made imminently. I had to respect the fact that we needed to do that through the parliamentary process last Wednesday, to seek their views, but not to replicate the considerable trauma that they went through giving evidence in a painstaking fashion, in an incredibly painful fashion, through that Brian Langstaff inquiry. And I'm meeting those charities, organisations and support groups. I obviously can't meet every single individual, but what I am trying to do is use that to inform the response of the government and to make representations to my colleagues about what needs to be done so that we can land this in the most effective place as soon as I can from the 20th of May.
Patricia Gibson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Does the Minister recognise that many people feel that the State, with all its delays in delivering justice to the victims of this scandal and their families, the State has utterly failed to recognise adequately the egregious harm inflicted and continues to inflict on those impacted, leaving tens of thousands of victims and their families in great suffering as they continue to wait for compensation?
Yes, I recognise that all delays are painful and frustrating and cause distress. And that's why I'm doing everything I can to move it forward as quickly as I can. I'm sorry that is repetitious, but it is the truth. And I've updated meaningfully today, I think, in terms of the legislation. But I know what we need to do, which is get to the 20th of May and as soon as possible come up with a comprehensive response on behalf of all of those people who've lost their lives and their families have been ruined by this absolute scandal that's happened over 50 years.
Graham Morris.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. May I also give my thanks to my right honourable friend, the member for Kingston upon Hull, for securing this urgent question, which gives me the opportunity to raise the case of my constituent Mark Fox, who contracted hepatitis C from infected blood when he was given a transfusion. He was just 4 years of age at the time. He was given contaminated factor VIII for his haemophilia. He was unaware of his hepatitis C diagnosis until he was 17. He was in care. He's been living with the health consequences of this scandal for over 40 years. He lost his job, we mentioned stigma. I say with all due respect to the Minister, because I know he's doing his best, the interim payments do offer a way of bringing relief to some of those survivors. Mark's asked me to ask the Minister how many more years will he have to wait before he receives either an interim payment or full and fair compensation for the suffering that he's endured.
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his heartfelt representation on behalf of Mark Fox, his constituent, and I'm sincerely sorry for what he's experienced, and I'm doing everything I can to bring as much clarity as possible. But I can't give him a definitive timetable today, but I'm working towards, I hope, giving a definitive timetable at the point or very soon after the publication of this final report. And I will do everything I can to bring as much clarity to all groups involved.
Hannah Bardell.
Speaker, it's been 7 years and 4 Prime Ministers since this public inquiry was set up, and there have been many, many decades waited before then. And the stories of children being impacted is surely, he will agree, tantamount to state-sponsored abuse. Abuse similar to that suffered by my constituent Linda Cannon, whose husband died after contaminated blood transfusion, or my Livingston constituent Vera Gaskin, who has stage 2 cirrhosis of the liver. Madam Deputy Speaker, Sir Brian Langstaff said it will clearly take political will to act quickly, but the circumstances here warrant it. So can I ask him, when will the victims, my constituents, our constituents and their families get compensation and justice? And surely he recognises that issues such as these, whether it's Primados, whether it's the post office scandal, whether it's contaminated blood, are taking decades and re-traumatising our constituents while they wait and often die just to get justice. It's not good enough.
Well, I very, very much recognise what she's saying with respect to the impact of time and suffering, and I want to bring it forward as quickly as I can. I'm doing that work and sponsoring the work to give the advice to make informed decisions that allow us to make a wide as possible decision in a few weeks' time.
Debbie Abrahams.
Deputy Speaker, and I too, speaking on behalf of my constituent who lost a brother and sister-in-law, and then whose nephew was left to be brought up with a family, raise the urgency of this. I do appreciate the Minister's sincerity about what he's trying to do and that he's only been in post a few months in this regard. But it's over a year now since Sir Brian Langstaff brought forward his report, said that interim payments were absolutely essential. And I'm trying to understand exactly where the block is. This is a year where, if it was a priority for this government, it would be done. So where is the block?
There isn't a block. There was last year a process of looking at how we can work out how much this costs and working out the way of translating, as I said earlier, those recommendations into operationalise them. That work is well underway. The work of Professor Sir Jonathan Montgomery and his team are helping with that. And as I say, in a few weeks' time, I hope that we can get to a point where we will be able to make a substantive assertion of what the government's position is.
Chris Stevens.
Deputy Speaker, in order to build trust and confidence, it requires the support of the infected and affected community. So can the Minister confirm that the independent body's executive will include representation from infected and affected groups who can make decisions on processes, eligibility and decision-making to build that trust and confidence?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question and for his engagement with me as one of the co-chairs of the APPG last week, where he made a similar point. I'm reflecting very carefully on what it takes to both satisfy the recommendation to have an independent body, independent of government, whilst also secure as much authority and confidence of the different communities. and I will update the House on that in due course.
Charlotte Nichols.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. My caseworker Paula was left bereaved as a teenager after her father was killed by HIV and hepatitis from infected blood products, and she suffered enormously since, including being bullied at school as a result of the stigma around HIV. Now in her 40s and battling cancer, and despite the recommendation from Sir Brian Langstaff's inquiry a year ago in April 2023 that children who lost parents should be awarded interim compensation, she is yet to receive a penny. How much longer will the government keep victims like Paula waiting?
I very much hope we'll be able to make a very clear assessment of what we're going to do in a matter of weeks, and I'm doing everything I can to be clear about depicting that for each different group, some going back 40, 50 years, and what the process will be going forward. We owe that to all these victims and their families, and I'm trying to be as comprehensive as I can in that response when it comes.
Deirdre Brock.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I wonder if I could ask the Minister, does he think that the Prime Minister and senior ministers will be attending the launch of that report on May the 20th?
Here, here. Here.
I don't know. I haven't had those conversations yet. If a representative of the government is asked to be there, then I'm absolutely sure that will be the case. And if it's me, I'll be very happy to attend.
Jim Shannon.
Madam Deputy Speaker, can I thank the Minister very much for his answers and a very clear commitment that the Minister has to deliver for all those who have severe health problems. But does the Minister not agree that reading some of the information supplied by the BBC feels more like reading of the national regime atrocities rather than action by our own health care professionals in the 1980s? It's quite distressing. How does the Minister believe that we can ever restore confidence in a process and procedures that allowed this to take place? And what assurances does the general public have that this could not take place ever again?
I thank the Honourable Gentleman for his question. When Sir Brian Langstaff reports, and I have absolute confidence in the authority of the report that he will bring forward when he publishes it, that will be the time for a response from the government to the wider implications of what went on and what evidence he has gathered. What we've seen in recent days, as I said at the start of my response this afternoon, is some elements of that, perhaps, but what I want to do is make sure that the government responds authoritatively and as completely as possible when that moment comes of publication.
I thank the Minister for answering the urgent